The story you are about to hear is not just about a neighborhood gone wrong. It is about what happens when power-hungry bullies put on fake uniforms and try to control lives they have no authority over. It is about what happens when they cross the wrong family. Because these so-called HOA cops thought they could intimidate, shout, and even raise their hands against an innocent woman. But what they did not realize was that this woman's husband was no ordinary man. He was a decorated Navy SEAL who had spent years facing enemies overseas. And when the fight came home, he was more than ready to strike back. It all started on a bright Saturday morning. The kind of morning where the air is calm, the lawns are freshly cut, and families step out to enjoy the peace of the suburbs. My wife was standing by our front yard, watering the flowers she had planted along the fence line. Roses, tulips, and bright yellow daffodils. They were her pride and joy. She loved making our yard a warm and welcoming place. She was smiling, enjoying the moment, when she saw a black SUV pull up across the street. 3 men stepped out. They wore matching navy shirts with bold white letters that read HOA cops. At first, she thought it was some sort of neighborhood patrol. But she quickly noticed that something felt off. Their uniforms were not standard. They looked like cheaply made knockoffs. Their badges were plastic. And their belts carried handcuffs and batons, but not the kind used by real law enforcement. They looked like props bought from a surplus store. My wife knew immediately these were not real officers. Still, she kept calm. The 3 men marched over, puffing their chests, shouting about rules and violations. One of them pointed at her flowers and barked, "These are not HOA approved. You've been warned before." My wife replied softly that there was no such rule, that she had checked the HOA handbook herself. But they did not care. They shouted louder. Neighbors began peeking from their windows, watching the confrontation. Then one of the fake cops stepped closer, too close. His face was red with anger. He jabbed his finger at my wife's face. "You better listen when we talk, lady," he snarled. "Next time, I'll make sure you get fined so hard you'll regret planting a single flower." My wife stood her ground. She was strong, but she also knew these men were unpredictable. She said, "You have no right to threaten me. Step back." But that only made them angrier. The tallest one lifted his baton, raising it like he was about to strike. The second one pulled out a pair of handcuffs and shouted that she was resisting HOA authority. And the third one, the loudest of the group, took a step forward as if he was about to slap her across the face. That was the moment I came out of the house. I had been inside, finishing my morning workout. I heard the shouting and felt something was wrong. The moment I saw those men surrounding my wife, my training kicked in. My blood boiled. I had faced enemies overseas who thought intimidation could break me. But this was worse. These men were not soldiers. They were cowards dressed up as fake cops, threatening the woman I loved. I walked across the yard, calm but filled with power. My footsteps were heavy, each one echoing in the silence that had fallen over the street. Neighbors opened their doors wider, whispering to each other. They knew me as a quiet man, the kind who kept to himself. Few of them knew my full background. Few of them knew I was a Navy SEAL. But they were about to find out. When I reached my wife's side, I put my arm around her shoulder and pulled her gently back. Then I locked eyes with the man who had raised his hand. My voice was steady. "If you lay one finger on her, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." The fake cop sneered. "Who's gonna stop me?" "You." That was his mistake. I stepped forward, my shoulders squared, and for the first time they noticed the shirt I was wearing. In bold letters across my back it read Navy SEAL. The words hit them like a thunderclap. The baton lowered slightly. The handcuffs wavered. But they were too full of false pride to back down. "You think being some washed-up soldier means anything here?" One of them spat. "This is HOA property. We run things." I smiled coldly. "You run nothing. You're not even real cops. And now you've crossed the line." The tension in the air was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. My wife clutched my arm, but I squeezed her hand to let her know I had it under control. Neighbors were now filming on their phones. This showdown was no longer private. It was being documented. The loudest fake cop, the one who had nearly slapped her, took a step closer and puffed up his chest. He thought he could scare me. He had no idea what real fear was. I had seen it in war zones. I had felt it in the dead of night on missions that no one ever talks about. And compared to those moments, this was nothing. I lowered my voice and leaned slightly forward. "Last chance. Walk away before this becomes a lesson you'll never forget." But instead of walking away, he laughed in my face. The other 2 joined in, a chorus of arrogance. One of them shouted, "Let's teach him a lesson instead." The one with the baton swung it toward my shoulder. Time slowed down. I sidestepped, caught his wrist, and twisted. The baton clattered to the pavement. Gasps echoed from the watching neighbors. Before he could react, I shoved him back and he stumbled onto the grass. The second one lunged at me with the handcuffs, trying to clamp them onto my wrist. I grabbed the chain midair, yanked it forward, and spun him around. In seconds he was locked in his own cuffs, arms twisted awkwardly behind his back. He shouted in pain, but there was nothing he could do. The third one froze, unsure whether to attack or run. My eyes bore into his. "You want to try too?" I asked. His lips trembled. He stepped back. But I was not finished. Because this was not just about me or my wife. This was about the entire neighborhood. These men had been terrorizing residents for weeks, pretending to be an authority they were not. They had issued fake fines, banged on doors at night, and spread fear like a disease. Now they had gone too far. I turned to the crowd of neighbors. These men are frauds. They are not cops. They are not HOA enforcers. They are criminals. And today they tried to put their hands on my wife. Cheers rose from the neighbors. Some shouted encouragement. Others clapped. For too long, people had stayed quiet out of fear. But seeing them exposed like this gave them courage. The fake cop who had raised his hand earlier tried to regain control. "You can't touch us. We'll have you arrested," he screamed. I pulled my phone from my pocket, held it high, and said loud enough for all to hear, "Then let's call the real police and see what they think." The color drained from his face. He knew the game was over. The other two stayed silent, one still on the ground clutching his wrist, the other writhing in his own handcuffs. But even though they were cornered, I was not letting them off easy. My voice carried down the street like a warning. "If you ever come near my wife again, if you ever pretend to be something you're not, I won't just stop you. I'll make sure every law in this country comes crashing down on you. Do you understand?" The silence that followed was deafening. The neighbors watched, their respect for me burning brighter with every word. My wife looked up at me with pride in her eyes. She had always known I was strong. But today everyone else knew it too. And that was only the beginning. Because once the Real police arrived and heard what had happened, the truth about these fake HOA cops would unravel in ways they never expected. The crowd of neighbors stood frozen, phones in their hands, recording every second of the showdown. The fake HOA cops were shaken but still trying to keep up their act. I had already disarmed two of them and locked one in his own cuffs. The third one had stepped back, but his pride would not let him walk away completely. He puffed his chest and shouted, "You think this is over? The HOA runs this neighborhood. You're just another resident under our rules." The words made me laugh. Not because they were funny, but because of the arrogance dripping from them. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You don't run anything. You are cowards hiding behind fake badges and cheap uniforms. And now the whole neighborhood knows it." My wife was still by my side. Her hand clutched mine and I could feel the trembling in her fingers. Not fear. Not weakness. But adrenaline. She had just been seconds away from being slapped, and now she was watching those same bullies crumble under their own lies. She whispered softly, "Don't let them get away with this." And I promised her, they won't. Just then one of the neighbors, an older man named Mr. Carter, stepped forward. He had lived in the community for over 30 years and had seen the rise of the so-called HOA cops. He raised his voice and said, "I've had enough of this nonsense. They've been harassing us for months, fining us for fake violations, threatening families, knocking on doors in the middle of the night. I told everyone they weren't real, but nobody listened. Well, today you've all seen it with your own eyes." The neighbors began to murmur in agreement. Some nodded. Others shouted out their own experiences. One woman said they had demanded money for a supposed landscaping violation. Another said they had threatened to tow her car if she didn't pay them cash on the spot. The lies unraveled fast. And every word the neighbors spoke tightened the noose around these fake cops. The one with the baton still on the ground tried to crawl away, but I blocked his path. "You're not going anywhere," I told him. His face twisted in anger, but he stayed put. The sound of sirens broke the tense silence. Real police cruisers turned the corner, lights flashing red and blue across the neighborhood. The crowd parted as the cars pulled up. The fake cops suddenly lost all their confidence. The one in cuffs stammered, "We can explain. It's not what it looks like." But everyone knew exactly what it looked like. The officers stepped out, their real uniforms and real badges shining in the sun. The difference was night and day. Authority has a weight that cannot be faked. The commanding officer approached, looking at the three men on the ground and then at me. "What's going on here?" Before I could answer, half a dozen neighbors spoke at once. "They're fake cops. They've been harassing us. They tried to hit his wife. The story spilled out like a flood. The officer raised his hand for silence. Then he looked directly at me. "Sir, tell me what happened." I explained everything clearly. How my wife had been watering flowers. How these men showed up with fake uniforms and tried to intimidate her. How one had raised his hand as if to strike her. How I stepped in, disarmed them, and protected her. I kept my tone calm and steady the way I had been trained. No exaggeration. No drama. Just the truth. The officer nodded slowly. He turned to the three men and demanded, "Badges. Identification. Now." The tallest one stammered. We don't have it on us." "Then what exactly are you?" the officer pressed. The man opened his mouth but no words came out. His face turned pale. The officer reached down and picked up the cheap plastic badge lying on the pavement. He held it up for everyone to see. "This isn't a badge. This is a toy. You've been impersonating law enforcement. That's a felony." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The fake cops knew their game was over. The officer gave a sharp order. "Cuff them." The Real police moved fast. The man I had twisted into his own cuffs was freed only so they could put him into proper restraints. The other two were hauled up from the ground and shoved against the squad cars. Their protests filled the air but nobody listened anymore. Their words had lost all power. My wife let out a shaky breath of relief. She leaned into me, her head against my shoulder. "It's finally over," she whispered. But I shook my head. "No. This is just the beginning." Because I knew arrests were not enough. These men had been operating for months. Someone had given them the confidence to pull this off. Someone had fed them the idea that they could get away with running a fake police force in our neighborhood. And I was determined to find out who was really behind it. The officer turned back to me. "Sir, I have to say you handled yourself well. Most people would have panicked. You kept them under control until we got here." "Military background?" I nodded once. "Navy SEAL." His eyes widened with respect. "Explains a lot. Thank you for protecting your wife. We'll take it from here." But even as they loaded the fake cops into the back of the cruisers, I could see the way the men glared at me. Their eyes were filled with hatred as if I had ruined everything for them. I knew then this was not over. They were pawns, but behind them was something bigger. That night, the neighborhood buzzed with talk. People knocked on our door to thank us. Families who had stayed silent finally felt safe enough to speak. We learned the fake cops had been extorting money, thousands of dollars in fake fines. They had controlled people through fear, threatening to call in authorities that never existed. My wife sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, still shaken but proud. She said softly, "If you hadn't come outside when you did, I don't know what would have happened." I squeezed her hand. "They made one mistake. They thought you were alone. They didn't know who they were dealing with." The next morning I received a call from the police department. They wanted me to come down and give a full statement. I went. What I heard there only confirmed my suspicions. The three men were not acting alone. They had a leader. Someone who had supplied the uniforms, the fake badges, even the SUV. Someone who called himself the HOA chief. The officer said, "We've had reports about this group in other neighborhoods. They move in, set up fake enforcement, and start collecting fines. People pay out of fear. Most don't question it until it's too late." I leaned forward. "So you're saying this wasn't just about us? This is a bigger operation?" The officer nodded grimly. "Exactly. And with your help, we can shut them down." That was all I needed to hear. My SEAL training had taught me never to back down from a fight. And now the fight was clear. These fake HOA cops had been exposed, but their network was still out there. And I was not about to let them keep preying on innocent families. When I returned home, my wife met me at the door. "What did they say?" I told her everything. Her eyes widened. "So it wasn't just here?" "No," I said. "It's bigger. And I'm going to see it through." She looked at me with pride and worry mixed together. "Just promise me one thing. Promise me you'll come back safe." I pulled her into my arms. "Always." But deep inside, I knew the battle was only escalating. Because once you cut off the pawns, the king makes his move. And somewhere out there, the so-called HOA chief was already planning his revenge. Days passed after the arrest of the three fake HOA cops. The neighborhood began to breathe easier. Families who had been hiding in fear now came outside. Children played in the streets again. For a moment, it felt like peace had returned. But I knew better. My instincts told me the storm was not over. And my instincts had never failed me. The police confirmed my suspicion. They traced the operation back to a man who called himself the HOA chief. He had been running similar scams in multiple neighborhoods, planting his men like weeds, letting them spread fear, and then cashing in on the money they collected. The three men who had confronted my wife were just tools. Disposable pawns in his bigger scheme. And when pawns fall, the king always notices. It was a quiet evening when it happened. My wife and I were sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, when a black SUV slowed down in front of our house. But this was no ordinary SUV. Its windows were tinted pitch black, the kind that screamed trouble. It didn't stop. It rolled past slowly, almost like it was marking us, before disappearing around the corner. My wife looked at me, her eyes wide. "That's them, isn't it?" I nodded. "The chief is watching." That night I barely slept. Every sound outside kept me on edge. But I wasn't afraid. I was preparing. When you've been a SEAL, you don't wait for the fight to come to you. You meet it head on. The next morning I received a message. No phone call. No knock on the door. Just a folded piece of paper slid under our front mat. It read, "Back off. Or next time we won't miss." I crumpled it in my hand. This was no longer just about scams or fake fines. They had made it personal. They had threatened my family again. That was their second mistake. I contacted the officer I had spoken to earlier. He confirmed that the HOA chief was still at large, hiding behind layers of fake paperwork and false identities. The department was working on it, but progress was slow. I knew then that waiting would not cut it. If I wanted this threat gone, I would have to take action myself. So I began to prepare. I studied the pattern of their SUVs. I watched the streets late at night. And eventually I spotted them. A different SUV this time, parked just a few blocks away, two men sitting inside watching the houses. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they were already prey. I walked straight up to their window, knocked once, and when the glass rolled down I leaned in and said calmly, "Tell your boss I'm coming for him. And tell him to bring everyone he's got." The men froze. One of them stammered, "You don't know what you're messing with." But I just smiled. "I've faced worse than you in places you can't even imagine." They drove off, rattled, and I knew my message had been delivered. The showdown came sooner than I expected. 2 nights later, our neighborhood was quiet when the sound of multiple engines broke the silence. SUVs rolled in, their headlights cutting through the dark. Doors opened. Men poured out, all wearing the same fake uniforms, all carrying batons and cuffs. At the front stood a man larger than the rest, his head shaved, his eyes cold. The HOA chief. He shouted across the street, his voice booming. "You think you can embarrass me? You think you can put my men in jail and walk away? Tonight you pay." Neighbors peeked from their windows, terrified. My wife stood behind me, but I told her firmly, "Stay inside. This is between me and them." The chief smirked. "A tough guy, huh? Navy SEAL or not, you can't fight all of us." I stepped forward into the glow of the headlights, my voice steady. "I don't need to fight all of you. I just need to take down the man pulling the strings." The chief snarled and signaled his men. They began to spread out, surrounding me. But what they didn't know was that I had already called the police hours earlier. I had predicted this move. My training was not just about strength. It was about strategy. I let them circle me. I let them believe they had the upper hand. And then, just as the chief lifted his hand to order the first strike, sirens wailed in the distance. Red and blue lights flashed across the street. Real cruisers came barreling around the corner. The fake cops froze, panic spreading across their faces. The chief turned to shout at them, but it was too late. The real officers swarmed the scene, weapons drawn, ordering everyone to the ground. Neighbors cheered from their porches as justice arrived. The chief tried to run, but I intercepted him. He swung at me, wild with rage. I ducked, countered, and drove him back with precision strikes. Years of training surged through me. Every move was controlled. Every strike deliberate. Within seconds, the self-proclaimed chief was on his knees, gasping for air, his power stripped away. The police cuffed him and hauled him up. He glared at me one last time, his voice hoarse. "This isn't over. There are more of us." I leaned close and said quietly so only he could hear, "Then tell them all the same thing. If they come here, I'll be waiting." The officers loaded him into the cruiser. The rest of his men were rounded up and taken away. The neighborhood was safe at last. When it was finally over, I walked back to my porch. My wife ran into my arms, relief flooding her face. "It's done?" she asked. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "It's done." But I knew in my heart that the fight against corruption and cowardice never truly ends. There would always be another bully, another scam, another shadow hiding in the suburbs. But now the whole neighborhood knew the truth. And they knew that when fake authority comes knocking, real strength will always rise to meet it. From that day on, the HOA was no longer feared. The fake cops were gone. The chief was in jail. And my wife could stand in her garden again, watering her flowers without looking over her shoulder. And me? I was just glad I had been there that morning. Glad I had stepped outside when I did. Because the men who thought they could slap my wife learned the hardest lesson of all. You never mess with a Navy SEAL's family. That wraps up today's story, friends. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit like, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more HOA drama stories, and don't forget to drop your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from you.